But let's get past the sideline that Fischer shows from Tall versus Larsen 59, and let's return to the actual game. So Fischer plays bishop d5, and then after that, uh, interestingly enough, uh, Larsen plays rook a c8. Now, as discussed earlier, one of the central plans in the dragon is, of course, to attack along the c-file. But Fischer calls this move, rook a c8, he calls it the losing move. And after the game, Larsen explained he was playing for a win and therefore rejected the forced draw with this alternative line. Knight takes d5, bishop takes g7, knight takes c3 check, and then b takes c3, and then rook fb8, c takes b4, queen takes b4, queen takes b4, rook takes b4, should b2, rook a b8, black will get the bishop back, etc. There are a couple alternatives to this line. After bishop takes, instead of bishop takes g7, Fischer could go with e takes d5, queen takes d5, queen takes b4. And this is actually what Fischer had intended to play had Larsen done that, because he did not want to go for the draw. Fischer points out that this move, rook fc8, it renders white's extra pawn useless, but the point is that this variation still leads to a draw. And Fischer calls this the losing move because he basically says that by not taking this bishop when he has the chance, he gives white so many opportunities to get this bishop that he is going to make that kind of the decisive factor in the game. According to computer analysis, this isn't exactly the losing move, but that's because Fischer does not find a refutation that's very, very, very long down the road. Rook a8 is indeed an error, no doubt, but calling it the losing move is an exaggeration, according to both Stockfish and Garry Kasparov. But there's no doubt that Fischer is correct that that Larsen should have indeed, quote unquote, snapped the bishop. So after rook a8, bishop b3, and Fischer writes he will not get a second chance to snap the bishop. He writes, "Now I felt the game was in the bag if I didn't botch it. I'd won dozens of Skittles games in analogous positions and had it down to a science. Pry open the H-file, sack, mate." This could be the most famous annotation in all of chess books. And Fischer sounds very, very confident here, but he really felt in this position that he was going to be unbeatable. So after bishop b3, then Larsen plays rook to c7. Fischer writes, "The loss of time is unfortunately necessary if black is ever to advance his a-pawn." And then he writes that if he says queen b5, is refuted by bishop takes a7. So rook c7, the loss of time is just meant to stay on guard of that pawn, no doubt. h4, and here we now see the beginning of white's attack, and we see why it's so dangerous. Fischer is going to look to sacrifice this h-pawn for sure, to try to trade it for the g-pawn, or trade it for black's g-pawn. His g-pawn will also be coming, and then he will be looking to place both of his rooks on the various files, and then not only that, we see the pinned f-pawn because of white's very, very well placed king's bishop that's doing so much work, both defensively and offensively. This bishop could be the most perfectly placed piece possible on the board, as well as you have this bishop looking to snap off black's dragon bishop. So we see already all of the principles are there for what Steinitz would call a well-founded attack. So then Larsen, queen b5, and Fischer writes there's no satisfactory way to impede white's attack, and he gives a large number of different variations that probably come from Fischer's own Skittles games that he's played in this particular. So he gives alternative defenses after h4. he shows h5. After h5, g4. If h takes g4, h5, g takes h5, knight takes g4, knight takes e4, queen e3, knight f6, he takes h5, e5, h6, and Fischer says this will win. And you can see why. I mean, the sheer domination that white will have on those h-files looks terrible. But there are a lot of different sidelines. Instead of h, he shows rook fc8, which is basically the counterattack of black on that file. Rook dg1, take g4, h5, g takes h5, f takes g4, knight takes e4, queen f4, e5, queen takes e4, e takes d4, g takes h5, king h8, h6, bishop f6, and then rook g7, and then white wins. And that just looks absolutely beautiful. I mean, that attack just looks amazingly beautiful. But there are all sorts of other alternatives that Fischer gives as well. We see, right, that after bishop takes, then pawn takes, this is going to be forced. And now white will have a mate that will be coming very, very, very shortly. Now, this is not necessarily the easiest mate to calculate, but we see with the rook and the queen and the exposed king where that mate might come from. So as an exercise in this position, I invite you to pause the video and see if you can now find just how white will be able to hunt down black's king in this position.